Hi, sorry. So hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today about how to host a virtual AGM. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are going to be muted for the duration of the webinar. And if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom, and we'll go through and address all of the questions at the end. So here's just an introduction to your hosts. My name's Danny Starr. I'm the Director of Marketing Strategy at Cyan Solutions. For those of you that may not be familiar, Cyan Solutions is a full-service marketing agency based in Chinatown here in Ottawa, and we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. We have a significant roster of association and nonprofit clients, and people have been asking us a lot about virtual AGMs for the past 3, 4, and 5 months. And so I started doing some research on the topic, and in doing so, I ran into a blog post from CANARIE, who we do some work with, written by their CFO, Nancy Carter. So when the COVID outbreak happened and people started asking again about virtual AGMs, I reached out to CANARIE and they offered to co-host this podcast with us so that they could share their learnings about hosting a virtual AGM. Nancy, do you want to say hi to people for a second and talk a little bit about CANARIE?
Sure, thanks, Danny, and thank you so much for hosting this very relevant webinar. So I'm Nancy Carter, as Danny had said, I'm the Chief Financial Officer at CANARIE, and our team has been hosting our AGM virtually since 2016. One of the things CANARIE is perhaps best known for is operating and managing the Canadian part of the Global Research and Education Network. Extremely pertinent at the moment is the fact that our network connects scientists and researchers from around the world to work on global challenges for humanity, like the one that we're currently experiencing. So I'm happy to be here and happy to participate in this webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. We also have with us a few subject matter experts in specific areas. We have with us Malcolm Bartlett, who's the IT manager at CANARIE. He's going to join in here in a bit when we talk a little bit about platforms. We also have with us Scott Murray and Cameron Watson from Clear Picture. Clear Picture offers a cloud-based managed e-vote solution. We've used them before at Cyan. It's secure and encrypted, customizable, and quite user-friendly. So if there's any specific questions about running e-votes or complicated e-votes during here, we have some subject matter experts that we can bring in. So to review a little bit about why you might want to host a virtual AGM. Well, one thing would be increased attendance. So even before the COVID outbreak, people were looking for ways to increase the attendance to their AGMs, and offering a virtual component to an AGM is a great way to be able to have more people show up. Ultimately then too, you have the options to create a better experience because you can do things with video and rich slides and detailed presentations and everything. At the same time, because you're doing it virtually and not paying for an event space and all of the costs that come along with those, you can lower your costs. And at the same time, it's worth saying that there's a few different ways that you can host an AGM. A hybrid AGM is where you would combine an in-person meeting with a virtual component, or you can do an AGM that's entirely virtual. So Nancy's going to talk a little bit about CANARIE's specific experience with virtual AGMs.
So as we all know, holding an AGM is necessary from a compliance and statutory perspective. It can be costly to hold an AGM, even though it's really quite a short event. And recent changes in the not-for-profit legislation have made it harder for people to, and this was our experience, harder to combine your AGM with maybe your annual conference because you have a limited time in which to do your AGM according to the legislation. And If your members are or stakeholders are spread across the country as ours are, it's difficult to get them together easily. And to be clear, it's really hard to get people excited about an AGM. So we found that we often had limited attendance, and many of our members were assigning proxies rather than showing up at the AGM themselves. So all of these reasons made us consider how we could do our AGM differently.
Was there anything in terms of costs or any cost considerations for you, Nancy?
So the cost consideration was really about, it wasn't significant for us in terms of the cost of hosting an in-person AGM, because we always co-located it with our annual conference. The change in legislation made that impossible. And so then we looked at hosting it on its own, and that would have been extremely costly. And we knew that we would be unable to get people to attend because they would have had to travel just specifically for the AGM.
Cool.
And the cost of hosting it virtually was, virtually nothing.
Cool. Okay. So what about you? What sort of success did you have?
So many of our members attended. It was fantastic. That was a key metric for us. We saw very little use of proxies, and so that was a huge measure for us, having people show up themselves. And our members found it super easy to attend because they didn't have to leave their office. Some of the members hosted our AGM in their boardroom and had their entire staff participate in the AGM because they all wanted to know more about what CANARIE had done over the past year. I firmly believe that the only reason they come to the AGM is because of the financial presentation. But the attendees found it really seamless showing up at the meeting. Click on a link and you're instantly connected to the AGM. So since 2016, we've had continued positive feedback from our members. They engage in our AGM and they look forward to it every year. So it's been fantastic.
Amazing. So I think this is a good sort of segue into the next section, what we're going to talk about, which is governance. So just to confirm, everybody should be verifying their bylaws or their governing legislation before moving forward with their virtual AGM. The Ontario government did pass an emergency order on March 31st that would permit nonprofits to hold electronic meetings of directors or shareholders and members. But even if the bylaws don't allow for it, but it's important to say that the communication has to be simultaneous and instantaneous. So sort of email chains and things along those lines wouldn't be satisfy this requirement. The other thing that I think is important for everybody to think about when thinking about doing a virtual AGM is that they check their rules on quorum and think about how they're going to measure that.
Great. So I'm happy to weigh in there for a bit. Our bylaws allow us to hold a virtual AGM. So you're right. That's the first thing you want to check. And then making sure that you have quorum for your AGM. So typically, if we have nothing contentious in our AGM, we require 51% of our members to be there and voting. So we start tracking and monitoring the attendees from the time we send out our notice to members, which is sent out a month before the AGM. We ask all of our members to RSVP and either RSVP that they're coming or RSVP and assign a proxy. And so we have one staff member who's monitoring that attendance list quite carefully all the way up to the day of the AGM. If we are not getting responses, we phone and email our members. The target that we go for is to make sure we have 75% committed to attend or to have a proxy. So right up to the day of the AGM, we're tracking that, and then we know how many people we're expecting. The day of the AGM, as soon as people start signing in and showing up, virtually at the AGM, we start taking attendance to track and make sure that we have the quorum that we need for our meeting. So that's quite a large process, and we have one person who's responsible for managing that for the month leading up to the AGM.
Cool. Actually, a couple questions coming in that might be okay to address at this stage. One is like, how do you verify the person attending is indeed a member?
So that's part of we have two people sitting in the AGM room with us, or in our boardroom, and they're checking to make sure that that person is signed up, because we know who's supposed to be coming, we know who the members are. So we have a tracking list that they're ticking off against that tracking list.
Okay. Another specific question was something about what do you mean by the change in legislation made it impossible for you to have your AGM as part of the conference?
Oh, I'm sorry. So yes, a good question. So when we had to continue our incorporation under the new Canadian legislation, the new Canadian Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, we became beholden to the legislation that says you have to have your AGM within 6 months of your year end. So our year end is March 31st. 6 months from then is September 30th. And September is not a great month in the industry that we work in for us to be having a conference. And so our conference is typically held in October or November. And so that put us outside of the window for being able to co-locate our AGM with our annual conference.
Cool. And just one small question for a bit of context. How many members do you have, Nancy?
We currently have about 140 members.
Okay. There's a question here about promotion. We'll address that, I think, in the next section as we get into sort of planning here. So let's start talking about planning your virtual AGM and get specific on some tips that we have. So I think the best place to start is to really think about planning your AGM and think about the experience from the attendee's perspective and focus really everything around that. So thinking about what attendees want to see, if you're broadcasting presentations, you want to think about sort of what the backdrop is, who the speakers are going to be and what they're going to wear, and really focus on the slides and what the presentations are going to look like. Then you need to start thinking a lot about what the attendees need to know about the AGM. Obviously, the date and time are really important, but outside of that, like technical details and how you're going to be providing support for people is also really important, and thinking about whether or not you're going to need bilingual materials. Then I would recommend that you spend a lot of time thinking about how you're going to share the details with your members, and every effort to make sure that they know exactly what the experience is going to be like and how it is that they connect with you and each other. So I think Nancy can help provide a little bit more detail here based on her experiences.
Sure, I'll go through each of those actually. So you're right. I think we want the attendees to feel like they're with us, and so we want it to be a professional looking AGM. So we hold our AGM in our boardroom, and that's where we do the webinar from. And we make sure that we have a very plain background behind us, but we typically have, one of the CANARIE banners or a CANARIE logo somewhere behind us. That's the backdrop for the speakers. And we have 3 speakers for our AGM. We have the president and CEO, and we have the chair of our board, and then I'm the 3rd speaker, the chief financial officer. And so those 3 people are the part that you would see if you were attending our AGM, and you don't see the other like 20 people who are supporting us in the other parts of the organization or in the boardroom. And then we have a presentation. So the chair of the board gives a presentation to members about things that have happened during the year, as does the president. And those presentations are all beautifully synced because we have French and English, but we have them both synced on one slide. And so that anybody who, the materials are accessible to anybody who attends our meetings. We make sure that the speakers don't have competing outfits. We had a wardrobe malfunction one year where the CFO, that was me, and the chair had outfits that did not blend well together. And so the tip there is to have things that are relatively plain and not loud and checks and big flowers. So we learned that. That was one of our first years. In terms of what the members need to know, they obviously need to know the date and time, all the logistics. So they get a notice to members, the notice of the AGM. Once they register, they get a calendar invitation that goes into their calendar to make sure that it's easy for them to, at the right time, click on the link to get to the AGM. We provide them with probably more information than they need, but with repetition comes learning. So we give them materials that tell them how to join us on Zoom, gives them screenshots about how they might join us on a mobile device, how they might join us on a laptop, all different kinds of technology. And the materials are so detailed that they can't possibly go wrong. And those are replicated as soon as they RSVP, they get that information again. And then at the beginning of the AGM, we go through some of that at the front end, just like we did today. Some of the housekeeping, we'll talk to members about how they can participate, ask questions, how they can vote, that kind of thing.
One question that came up a couple times that might be good to address here is, Nancy, how were you able to limit it to members only?
Well, that's a good question. So we have monitored, we monitor all of the people who are signing in for the AGM. And I think Malcolm's better to answer this question actually than I am in terms of how they manage when somebody shows up at the AGM that's not supposed to.
Sure. So how we did it is we use the email address of the members that are sent out the information, and they come in with that email address. And then we have somebody who monitors the people that are coming in, and they verify who they are by using the chat. And then that's basically it. You can also set up a registration process through the same procedure. We didn't use that because we didn't think we required it, but you can set up a registration process where your members can go there and register, and then they get a link and you get a detail. Every time somebody registers, you get a detail of who is registering, so you can keep track of who's coming in and then attending the meeting.
Okay.
So I think with some of the functionality that Zoom has, actually, we might update our process this year in terms of maybe we might consider using a password or that we would provide to members, or we might consider using the waiting room. So that's something we'll have to think about before our AGM. Fortunately, we have some time to think about that.
Yeah, okay. So let's move on and briefly address voting. There's a couple of questions maybe popping up about this, so it's a good time. So Zoom has a polling feature that you can use, and you can set your polls up in advance. From what I understand, this is typically great for a lot of the more procedural or housekeeping type voting that you may be doing. But if you have a mixture of voting and non-voting attendees, you may need to run another solution in tandem. And particularly in cases where the vote is contentious, security and analytics may be important. So that may be the time at which you may want to engage or look at certain third-party tools in order to be able to run a secure vote. One question that sort of comes up here in relation to online voting, and maybe Clear Picture can jump in and provide some a bit of a solution to this or something, but it's saying, I'm wondering about voting on resolutions and making and showing amendments as they are made before the final vote. So I think what you need to be able to do here is have the system sort of update itself as it's going along. Clear Picture, can you maybe provide Scott or Cameron provide any sort of idea on that?
It's Scott speaking. Are you talking mainly questions from the floor?
Yeah, I've got some questions coming up here.
Yep. No, I mean in the particular voting instance that you were talking about there, are you talking about how a solution can keep up with
Yeah,
questions?
I think that's the basics of it, what they're asking.
Yeah, so we what we try to do is when we sit down with our customers, we analyze their whole process of vote from security all the way through to reporting. With the single sign-on feature that we have and the security around our platform, we try to encourage them to limit the amount of amendments on the floor, but we can run that vote through our platform live.
Okay. I'll mark that as answered, and if there's more, we can come back to it. Okay. So there's some stuff bubbling up about technical details, so let's move on to that section as well now too. So I think what's really important here is to really make sure that you get the technical details straight. And a couple of the key variables you want to look for when looking at the different platforms is one, the number of attendees that you have. Some solutions may work great for small groups, but not so great when you get up into the few thousands of members. So you want to be thinking about that. You also want to be thinking about how you're going to be showing the information. Are you going to be sharing slides? Is there going to be video? Are you going to have live presentations? At the same time, especially present lately, has been the discussions about security of the different platforms. You want to make sure to password protect everything. From a sound perspective, you want to make sure that you have your microphones tested and everything of that nature, and think about how you're going to handle questions. There's also a lot of discussion lately about chat functions and the privacy of chat. So you want to figure out if you're going to enable chat as part of your virtual AGM, or if you're going to disable that. And lastly, what I think is important here is that you choose a platform and do some tests before you run your virtual AGM. And I think it's a good time to bring Malcolm back here, as he can talk a little bit about the solutions that he evaluated for CANARIE.
Yeah, so when we first did this, Zoom really wasn't on our radar. We were looking at other solutions. I think a couple that come to mind was Lumi Global, or Lumi, which I think is a UK company, and then also Simply Voting. We kind of wanted to have an all-in-one solution, so we kind of wanted to have the video and the actual question and answer piece available through both. And so it's kind of sort of eliminated a couple of them. I think Lumi now has a conference ability, but during the time when we were negotiating with them, they said we'd have to use Cisco WebEx as well. So then we switched over and looked more closely at Zoom. And then most of the things that we required, we sort of got through Zoom, and so that's sort of what we chose. And then, as opposed to having a tool to vote and similar to Lumi, we decided to just do it by verbal, and then and that sort of satisfied the needs that we required for ours.
One of the questions that come up here that's probably a good time to address this is the idea or the security around Zoom. Do you think you'll continue to use it, Malcolm, or would you look for another platform?
No, most definitely. Actually, I got off a call early this morning with a lot of the Zoom execs. It was a call that we were invited to for the research and education across the globe, talking about security, and they're assuring everybody that they've changed a little bit of their privacy policies, and they've assured everybody that they're meeting all the requirements for security and privacy. And they've got lots of features that probably a lot of people aren't really aware of. There's features like when you get everybody in the meeting, you can unlock the meeting so nobody else can come in. You have your virtual waiting room where you can actually look to see who's in the virtual waiting room and verify who they are before you actually let them in the meeting. So you don't let any hooligans in that might disrupt the meeting. There's also the password feature, and there's several other features that they have that can actually help you in securing your meeting so that there's no disruptions and no issues.
One thing too, I just know from my own reading about the security, because obviously Zoom's what we chose to run this too, is that I think there's sometimes a bit of a difference in discussion between running something as a webinar and a meeting, right?
Yeah.
And I think some of the security concerns that people were talking about dealt specifically with having meetings versus webinars. So I think when looking at that discussion, that was something I was particularly paying attention to, like what might apply for a meeting versus what would apply for a webinar. And a lot of the discussions seem to be around these issues relating to meetings and stuff. So that's something to think about there.
That is correct.
Okay.
I'll just note that another thing they're working towards is they are working towards one of the questions that came up was actually about AGMs, virtual AGMs, and they are working towards a new voting tool that you can use to do voting and where you can actually assign where people have proxies and stuff for many members, and you can assign a weighting to that vote. And also other security features around it to make the voting a little more secure.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about some tips for running your virtual AGM. So if you're running your virtual AGM and there's a bunch of things that are going to be happening concurrently, like presentations and chat and everything like that, you should really consider 2 monitors, one for the presenters and one to see the chat activity. If you're doing this and there's going to be a room, you want to make sure that it's quiet so you're not near the reception or a high traffic area. And then from a lighting perspective, you want to watch obviously for glare and shadows and anything like that. Nancy, maybe you can provide a little bit more details based on CANARIE's experiences here.
Sorry, Danny, I was muted. I was talking, just couldn't hear me. So this is something that the IT folks at CANARIE spend a lot of time getting organized for, make sure that we have everything in the room that we need, and make sure that we don't have a lot of traffic going by the room. Make sure that we have the folks in the room who are going to monitor the attendance, and make sure that none of the equipment that they're relying on is going to break down. So Malcolm and the IT team always make sure that we have secondary backup laptops. They make sure that we have extra batteries in case the clicker doesn't work for the presentation. You name it, they've gotten the room ready, and they have it ready for a couple of days ahead of time because they just want to make sure that everything goes perfectly. In fact, one of the other things that we do is we make sure that we have a secondary internet connection just in case. So
that's that's all great stuff to sort of lead into our next tip, which is that people should rehearse. So they should really create a plan that lays out the timing for everything that's going to happen. They should provide notes for all of their speakers. Obviously, then have all of your decks created and approved beforehand. And then rehearse as many times as it takes to make sure that it runs smoothly. This is something that I did this afternoon here for sure, which is run a full technical run through about an hour before your AGM to make sure nothing has changed about your setups or permissions or internet connection and all those types of things. And then make sure you test the sound and video with external users. Nancy, do you want to add anything specifically here at this point?
Sure, I would say don't underestimate the rehearsals that you should do. I think the first year we probably did 25 rehearsals. We did rehearsals for the people who were participating as speakers. We did rehearsals then with more of our staff. We got people to listen in our staff to make sure that what they were hearing was what we wanted our audience to hear and our members to hear. We did load testing. We had everybody sign in on all of their devices to make sure that we weren't going to crash anything. So yeah, you cannot underestimate the requirements for rehearsal. You want to get it perfect.
It's just a quick question just to confirm. Nancy, you had about 50 people attend your event, right?
Yes. So the first year, we had about 50 people attend our AGM. We had fewer members then. I think we were expecting about 50, but that didn't account for the staff who were also signed in to do some of the taking attendance and things like that. And so what happened to us the first year was we realized we didn't have room in our Zoom room for all the people that needed to show up. So that's a critical factor. That was a lesson learned in year one. We can now have 500 people in our room for our AGM if required.
Do you know if you ever got to that, would you automatically be able to add more people on the fly, or do you get shut off at 500?
I think you would get shut off after 500. So that's what happened to us in year one. The 51st person who tried to couldn't get in.
Yeah.
Oops.
So let's talk a little bit about after your AGM. So I think what's really important here is that after your AGM, you start thinking about what went well. So how you can improve, document the process so that you create a detailed document that would guide teams in further years. And I think, Nancy, you can really flesh this out for us a bit based on your experiences, right?
Yes, sure, absolutely. So we have detailed scenarios for each of the presenters, which we've rehearsed. And as soon as the AGM is over, we go through those and make sure that it worked properly and that we didn't miss anything, so that we can, we have material ready for the next year. One of the things that we maybe talked about, but I want to emphasize, is that we have people available to feed us questions that are submitted. So as the presenters, we can't be watching the screens to see the Q&A that's coming in. So we have people designated to do that. I think that's really important because we want to engage with the members and we want to answer their questions if they have them. And we want to be able to address them in a timely way. So that for sure was a learning for us in the first year, and we've improved on that over the years. And we always run a post-mortem after every AGM. And so we can make sure that we add, change, or tweak anything that's in our AGM process document, which is our AGM Bible. It's got every step that everybody has to complete leading up to the AGM. And that we take quite seriously, and we start the project management process for that about 3 months before the AGM.
Cool.
There's always room for improvement, and I think probably every year we've added something new to our process.
Okay. So speaking of that, then there are some additional resources here, and we'll get into questions in a couple minutes. So anybody who may have some questions, feel free to type them in and we'll go through them shortly. If you're looking for additional information, obviously then CANARIE.ca has their very informative blog post that you can take a look at. And recently I found that the Ontario Nonprofit Network published a comprehensive guide to holding a virtual AGM. Interestingly enough, a lot of the information in that guide matches almost exactly with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about here. So if you download that, you can get a little bit more detailed on some of these issues. So I think now maybe what we can do is we can try to go through some of the questions here. With many of the organizations working from home, how could their AGM be staged from someone's home's office? Are there custom backgrounds that can be accessed? I know that in Zoom, if you're doing a meeting, there are custom backgrounds that you can add to your Zoom meetings. That much I know. I don't know if Nancy and Malcolm have anything they can add there.
Yeah, most definitely. You can definitely add in backgrounds to make it a more professional environment for your AGM, and also tagging on to another question, which is further down, which is about what about people who are on lockdown, stay in place. And one year of our AGM, our president of the board was remote in Edmonton, and we actually zoomed him in from Edmonton. So that kind of mimicked this sort of a scenario that we're in now. So you can actually have your three different people coming in from different areas, who will be presenting and then taking the questions throughout the meeting.
Cool. Thanks, Malcolm. One question that's been sitting here for a little bit since we were talking about governance is there a specific limitation within the regulations that supersedes your bylaws? Our bylaws allow us to have a special resolution to hold our AGM later than June 30th, and we were thinking of postponing to the fall. Financial requirements can be met outside of that. Not sure if you can provide any detail there, Nancy.
So I think it depends on what legislation is your governing legislation.
Mhm.
So we're governed by the Canadian Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, as I said, and that trumps our bylaws. And so we are beholden to that legislation. You can ask the minister for an exception. We've never done that. It seemed that we could probably manage by having the virtual AGM instead. And as I said, it's been so successful in terms of participation of members that I don't think we would ever go back to having an in-person AGM.
Yeah. Here's a question. Is there any concern about not using any video whatsoever? Our screen image will be our PowerPoint presentation, having only our presentation on hand to do verbal presentations.
Well, it's kind of similar to what we're doing now, I would think, where there's not much, there's no video, it's just a presentation. I think I'm not sure if that's the question that's being asked.
That's how I sort of read it to be. I mean, just where you're showing slides or something like that.
Yeah, I believe kind of a webinar kind of
Yeah.
format. The meeting is more video based, but it's still basically the same thing. The minute you run the presentation, it sort of takes over the screen, and the video is sort of on a backdrop. And in some cases, it's up to the end users. They don't have to have video on at all. They can just watch the presentation in full screen.
Yeah. I would add that in those situations, if it's that you didn't want to have somebody presenting on screen for any reason, potentially what you could do to make it more personal or something is use video or pre-recorded video or something of that nature, to maybe give what you're putting on the PowerPoint presentation a little bit more life or personality or something like that. So there's ways that you can do that without maybe showing somebody live on screen.
Yeah, Danny.
Yeah, I think the way we did it, we did it as well was we had it as an intro when people came in. It was full screen, and it was kind of milling about until the meeting started, and then it became serious. And then once the presentation started, they just disappeared up into a corner. If you wanted to watch them speaking or not, you could put them back in full screen. It was up to you if you wanted to watch the presentation or watch the speakers themselves.
Cool. Scott, did you want to add something?
Yeah, we've been for some of our clients, we've been looking at using video to actually record a video description of what they're voting on and allow that to be the body of the vote.
Oh yeah, okay. So if there's voting happening on a voting platform alongside the AGM, you're saying, Scott, then you could have some video that accompanies the vote on the voting platform to add a little bit more detail there.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've got a few associations looking at that right now.
Cool. Here's another question. I think this is about simultaneous interpretation. Did you ever run into that, Nancy, by any chance?
No, we never have. We've had questions from members that have come in. So we hold our AGM in English. Our speakers speak English, although we do some of our introductions in French. If we have a French question, our president is able to answer the question in French and has done so. But our presentations are always side by side, French and English. But we've never tried simultaneous translation on a virtual AGM. That would be a challenge, but
Yeah.
it's probably possible.
Yeah, what I'm just thinking off the top of my head on the fly about it, and maybe what you might have to do is try to offer some, like, I think of it as a secondary channel.
Yeah.
Or second, like you would have a second meeting room or something where somebody's listening, say, to the audio in English and translating it in French or something like that, maybe.
Yeah, you could maybe run a breakout room in a second language.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's different ways that you could do that. Here's another good question here. Can you offer any tips for keeping members engaged and in the room?
The members who are attending the AGM?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
so. If you're doing a virtual AGM, probably people might be thinking about ways to keep people engaged.
So we like to think that our presentations are quite interesting. I'll tell you what I do, because I always think that the financial presentation is the most exciting part of the AGM. And I tell people that. I say, I know you're here because you want to hear the financial presentation, but I always tell a joke before the financial presentation. And it turns out that some of our members come to the AGM to hear the joke. So that's, you have to keep people engaged the same way you keep them engaged if they were in person. You have to make them feel good. You have to make them feel that you're interested in giving them a good presentation.
Nancy, do you spend time really working on the presentations to try to shorten them too, to try to make sure that people that topics don't drag or anything of that nature?
Yeah, so typically the presentations that the chair of the board and the president of the organization will be giving are, great graphics and fantastic pictures put together by the marketing team. And then the presenters speak to that. So, we don't expect our members to show up and look at boring eye charts, PowerPoint eye charts. And so that is a way of engaging them, I think, as well. And so the presentations, because we've rehearsed so many times, that's where we cull some of the extra material. So we definitely make sure that they're short and concise and to the point. Our AGM never lasts longer than an hour, and it would be hard to keep people's attention for longer than that anyway. So.
Okay. Question here about concerns about internet bandwidth. Any of your members, Nancy, concerned about internet bandwidth or challenges with attendees that don't have access to broadband internet?
So the fortunate position that CANARIE is in is that all of our members are either work in technology sector or they're working at a university or college across the country. And because we run a network that connects them, we know they have great connectivity. So that's not a concern for us.
Mm-hmm.
But for sure it would be.
Yeah. I think, the phone-in option is even mentioned sort of at the end of the question here. Would be great in those sort of situations.
And Zoom offers that as well, right? You can call. Yeah.
So I think that's about it for questions.
So I have another tip that I forgot about, but one of the things that we do to coordinate the internal team, and this just started in the last year or two, is we run a Slack channel for the AGM, so that anybody internally who has to get attention of somebody else during the AGM, we run that Slack channel just to keep everybody coordinated. There's a way to communicate.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Danny, it's Cameron from Clear Picture. I just wanted to jump in on the question relating to split screen.
Mm-hmm.
Clear Picture, the platform that we offer provides a split screen scenario where the video on one side and the e-vote on the other throughout the AGM. So it's a secure solution that we're offering that provides secure video as well as e-vote with the results back in minutes throughout the AGM.
Cool.
So that is a functionality that we do offer.
Okay, so then somewhat related to that, we have a question. Then, do you show the results on screen? I know that for people using Zoom and the poll functions, I believe when the polls close, you can automatically share the results up to the screen. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that nature then, Cameron or Scott?
Well, there would be a scrutineer responsible for looking at the results. So there would be, you can assign however many people or whoever you want to see the results. The results can be audited or are audited. So if you have designated 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals that you want the results to come to, then that's who they go to.
Cool. Okay. All right. So if anybody has any follow-up questions or anything of that nature, you can contact me through simple@cyansolutions.com. If you want to follow up any questions with CANARIE, you can reach them at info@canarie.ca. And if you wanted to ask any more questions to ClearPicture, you can reach them at cwatson@clearpicture.com. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I hope you learned a lot. I certainly did in the last little while. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Hello?